in Burlington. And I joined the Air Force June the 5th, 1942 in Winston-Salem. And I was told to stay in the school until I was called. And that was February 1943. And we went to Miami Beach, Florida for basic training, like any other recruit, taking calisthenics and marching all over the streets with a Springfield rifle on our shoulder. From there we went to Furman University for 3 months of college training. Then we went to Nashville, Tennessee for classification as a bomber pilot or plane pilot, bombardier or navigator. Went through quite a few tests, both mentally and physically. From there I went to Montgomery, Alabama for pre-flight training. Pre-flight we went to Lakeland, Florida for primary training as a pilot. There you were given a lot of tests, and a lot of fellows were washed out at that point. From there I went to the next phase of training and called it basic flight training in Cortland, Alabama. And there we got into a heavier airplane, and while I was there I contracted pneumonia, and I got behind in my class for spending time in the hospital. But my instructor had me catch up, and I still graduated from this training base. From there I went to advanced flying training, Seymour, Indiana. And there we got into a twin-engine airplane. I believe it was called a AT-10. Anyway, I recall I had a new instructor. He had 5 students. So some student had to be selected to see whether the new instructor was doing his job. So he selected me to take a test ride. And the test ride was they took you to the test pilot took you to the end of the runway and put a hood over you so that your takeoff was fully in instruments. And you had to go up and do a series of maneuvers on the instruments and then bring the plane in for a landing. And one of the things that you're supposed to do is flip gas tanks somewhere during close to the end of the flight. And either I forgot to or I flipped it and it didn't turn it far enough, the switch. And the engine started sputtering. And the test pilot knew right quick. He flipped the switch and the motors caught up. And we finished the flight. And I got my commissions and wings. and my instructor kept his job, so I must have passed. That was one ordeal I remember. And another thing I recall, a buddy of mine, and we're supposed to go with others to an auxiliary field and practice night landings. And each was to make 4 landings, and then the other would take over the pilot seat. I made my 4, and he did his 4, but he was having trouble, and I recall that he hit the runway so hard that red fuel warning lights came on the airplane. So after he made 4, I thought we'd go home. And he said, "Would you mind me doing a couple more?" He said, "I got to learn to fly this airplane sometime." So we made a couple more flights and went home. But what was more risky, there must have been 25 other airplanes at this field, and planes were going in all directions. But anyway, after graduation, I went to first pilot school at Smyrna, Tennessee, to learn to fly B-24s. The squadron commander there was my instructor. And I remember that a story they told while I was there, that a colonel came in and landed a B-24. He leveled off so high that when he hit the runway, he totaled the airplane. And while I never saw this take place, a friend of mine many years later in Durham was a crew member, ground crew, at that base at the time it happened, and he confirmed the accident that the colonel had. And one of my things I recall, my instructor was a captain, and his home was in Norfolk, Virginia. And he said, "We're going to take a cross-country trip to Norfolk for the weekend." And he says, "I want you to fly the plane." So we went, and on the way back, we got into a thunderstorm. That's the first time I'd ever been in a thunderstorm with an airplane. And things were bouncing around pretty bad, and the instrument panel was mounted on rubber, and it was shaking so bad I could hardly read the instruments. And I know the instructor said to me, "I'm not too proud to turn around and go back." I said, "Well, I don't know how far we are into this." He says, "It may be further back than it is forward." But when we finally came out, we were over Greensboro. And prior to that, we didn't know where we were. And I know the wings on that B-24 were flapping just like a bird in that storm. But that taught me one big lesson, that the meteorology books always preached: thunderstorms, stay away. And I've always remembered it. I finished here at Smyrna Base outside of Nashville, went to Westover Field in Massachusetts to to get my crew together. And there I was able to select my co-pilot. He had gone through training in the same class I was in. When we graduated, he was sent to co-pilot school. But the rest of the crew, they asked if I would take two brothers that wanted to stay together. And I said, okay. But anyway, we got together and went to Savannah, Georgia to train as a crew. It was called a replacement depot. And while I was there, I had some of the worst experiences of my lifetime. One of the major problems, we were having too many crashes. They were using 90 octane gas in a plane designed for 100 octane. And they were flying planes around the clock, and they were not having proper maintenance because there wasn't time for maintenance. I went out about midnight to fly with my crew, and the wing lights wouldn't come on, so I wouldn't go fly the plane. The squadron commander said, we're getting ready for combat here, and anything goes. So he scolded me, but I still didn't fly the plane because there were a lot of airplanes. There were 3 fields in the proximity of Savannah. And if you didn't have lights so other planes could see you, it was a big risk in my mind. So I did not fly that night. But while I was there, one of the worst experiences I had while I was in the Air Force, a crew that sat next to us in a ready room for briefing, and I got to know most of the crew, and the pilot was one of the best friends I ever had. He was from Ohio, and he took off ahead of me, and I was sitting on the ramp waiting for my turn, and he had an engine catch on fire on takeoff, and he didn't have altitude, he didn't have speed, turned around to try to land on the runway, and he couldn't get lined up. Yeah, I guess he poured on the coal and lost another engine. And he saw all the planes lined up to take off, that if he came down on the field, he'd probably take 2 or 3 crews with him, and he chose to land in a pine thicket, and as soon as he hit, smoke and flames went up. One man got out of the plane, and he lived only an hour. That was one of the worst shocks, and I feel bad today thinking about what happened to such a fine group of young men. Their lives snuffed out. But anyway, the rules were, you go ahead and take off, and we did, but I could still see the smoke from that plane. So that is something I guess I'll never forget. But we had some accidents, I was in a hurry to finish a tour at that base. And presumably we were to get a week of furlough at home before going to combat if we finished early. Well, as it turned out, they needed, the orders came through for crews to go overseas, and we didn't get the week off. My crew went to Mitchell Field on Long Island, New York, to pick up a brand new B-24J series, beautiful airplane, flown there right from a factory. We took it up and flew around over Long Island some, sort of check it out. Next day we left for Bangor, Maine. We got to Bangor, Maine. We were held up going to the next base, and they never told you where you were going until you got ready to leave. But we found out at Bangor, Maine what the Long Johns were for. We were held up there 5 days because the next stop was Goose Bay, Labrador, and they were having 5 days of snow. Well, finally it stopped snowing, they cleared the runway, and we went on to Goose Bay, Labrador. And while we were there, B-17 went down between Bangor and Goose Bay. And they wanted to volunteer to go search for the plane. Of course, it was snow everywhere. And the St. Lawrence River, where we crossed it, was about like an ocean. It was so wide. Anyway, my co-pilot, who had trained as a co-pilot on the B-17, volunteered to go on the search thing, but they never did find the plane. Well, when we were to leave Goose Bay on the next flight, we took off in the middle of the night. It must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was dark and as cold as you've ever seen. That snow had piled up to the roof of the barracks. And we had little carved out walkways to get to the mess hall and other places. So we took off, and we couldn't get our landing gear up. And I don't know how cold it was, but it was terrible. And on the B-24 has a nose wheel, and all that cold air was coming right up to the pilot's compartment. I had on a pair of fur-lined leather gloves, and I told the tower I had trouble, I had to come in. They said, we got planes on the runway, you're going to have to stay up there a while. I said, I can only make one more circle of the field, and I'm going to have to come in. So they cleared the runway, and I came in, landed, and I had a ring on the finger of my left hand that I held the wheel with. And after I landed, my hand started warming up and swelling up. So I had to go to a flight surgeon, get him to take the ring off so I wouldn't lose that finger. Well, the tower or the control people at Goose Bay thought we were trying to avoid going to combat. I said, well, all you got to do is take the plane up. But they never did. They had to call technicians in from the factory to adjust the hydraulic system for a colder climate. When that was done, we took off for Greenland, but the landing gear kept creeping out of the wings. But we were able, with the lever, to get it back up. So we went on. But I'm on the way, my navigator got his hand somehow caught in the exhaust fan down in the nose compartment and chewed up his fingers pretty bad. The co-pilot had to go down and perform first aid. So we went on to Greenland, and the flight surgeon said, well, what you guys did as first aid did the job. Said it didn't look very pretty, but said it took care of things. And I recall everything was frozen over in Greenland. This is the end of November. And they had one runway on the side of a mountain. You would land going uphill, and you'd take off going downhill. And that was something brand new. When you come into land, you had to round out 2 or 3 times because you were going to land and going uphill. And I recall there was a big glacier out at the end of the runway. And cold, I'm telling you, it was cold. We took off the next day for Iceland. And on the way, we hardly saw the ocean because of cloud cover. And our wings began to ice up. And we found out what those rubber de-icing boots were used for on the leading edge of the airplane. And I'll tell you, they worked. They broke the ice and kept it off. Well, we got to Iceland. That 5 days of snow at Goose Bay had moved to Iceland as freezing rain. And it was a solid sheet of ice. And I'd never landed on a sheet of ice before. And there was a Canadian ferrying a B-25 ahead of me. And he slid off on the runway and nosed over. And I was a little bit uptight about what was going to happen to us. And I must have dropped it in from 20 feet. I hit pretty hard trying to get on the runway as quick as I could. But fortunately, we were loaded with supplies for the troops. And with that added weight, we were able to get the plane stopped before we got in trouble. I recall this was Thanksgiving Day, and we had turkey and ice cream served that night for the meal in Iceland. And all the other planes were iced over, and I took off the next morning for England, and I delivered the plane to Valley, Wales, which was a depot that the Air Force had. We left the plane, got on the train, and we still didn't know that we were going to B-17 base. But about halfway to our destination, some officer come by and handed me a stack of orders. He said, "You're now in charge of this train." He says, "Get these people cruise to where they're supposed to go. So every time a train stopped, I jumped off, trying to find out where we were and where we were going. Finally, we got to our destination, Sudbury, and there I spent most of December getting checked out, and the weather was real bad. That was the time of the Battle of the Bulge when it had the coldest weather on the continent they had had in many years. A lot of my friends that I was in school with at Chapel Hill were in that Battle of the Bulge and had frostbite. Anyway, I flew first flight as a co-pilot, which was tradition, and the target was Ham, Germany. And we didn't encounter much activity in the way of flak or fighters. And I don't recall the second mission, but that was my first trip as a pilot. And from January to April was winter time in England when they had a lot of fog. And when you didn't have fog, if you had a clear sky, the English burned a lot of coal, and you had smoke that settled in, almost like a fog, made it very difficult. You come back from a mission short of fuel, and you had trouble trying to find a runway to sit down on. But I had a very capable crew, and most of the time we had a good airplane. There was a lot of difference in the way a lot of them trimmed up. Some of them were a lot harder to fly than others. And we flew to and from a targeting formation, which meant the pilots were working all the time. But I suppose you'd have to say that we were a pretty fortunate crowd, because we had a lot of close calls twice, and I don't remember which missions. We came back, both wings had to be replaced due to flak damage, and neither time would the gas tanks hit. So something was looking out for us. And I didn't had one crew that got hit by flak, but it glanced off of him and didn't bring any blood. But it scared him. I recall that he was hollering. I thought he was really hurt, but he wasn't. He was scared. But there were a lot of times we were all scared. And I don't deny the fact that there were a lot of times that I wasn't so sure that I knew what I was doing. But we managed to make 35 trips. And one of the landings I made, I guess I'll never forget, we coming back from a mission and run into a squall line. And the atmosphere was really rough. And planes were all over the sky. And I said to my co-pilot, we're going to get out of this. So I hit the deck, and a terrific snowstorm. You couldn't see anything. We thought we'd land in France and go to Paris, but we couldn't begin to find the field, and we almost had a head-on collision with a DC-3. Luckily, he was a few feet under us. So we said, well, I guess we just have to go home. We got to the channel. We could tell by the waves that things were pretty rough. And we got to the home base. By that time, fuel was beginning to be a problem. And they had closed the base. Wouldn't let anybody land because there was a 65-mile-an-hour gale blowing, and it was very rough. And then here I was. We had 4 gas tanks, and the gauges were flopping off of empty. And I knew we couldn't bail out. We had to sit down somewhere. So I headed east, and close by there was a fighter base.